Thanks. Let me move you over. There you go. Yeah, thanks for coming, everybody. So this is a project about the meanings of the quantifiers each and every, the non-linguistic cognitive systems they implicate, and how details of those systems can help make some predictions about how the expressions get used. Okay, so starting with a bigger picture, though, theories of linguistic meaning often aim to account for things like how meanings are formally represented, how they can combine into larger units, how they get pragmatically used or interpreted in a context, and how they connect to non-linguistic cognitive systems. And just to paint with a really broad brush about this, formal approaches have tended to prioritize the first three. Cognitive approaches largely have prioritized the latter three. What would be nice is to have kind of one unified approach, a unified through line that tackled all four of these aspects. It's really hard, though, I think, to find phenomena where it'd even be possible to tell that kind of a story. For one thing, because it requires that you know something about each one of those levels. But that's one reason why we think quantifiers like each and every make for a good case study, because they represent a place where it is possible to give a formally explicit account of what the meanings look like, to say how that connects to non-linguistic cognition, and then to use properties of those cognitive systems to kind of derive some downstream predictions about how the expressions get used. So with that in mind, here's a roadmap for just the rest of this talk. I'll give you a quick background about each and every in particular. It's some linguistic and psycholinguistic data suggesting that each is somehow more individualistic. That data, I think, motivates a particular proposal about their meanings, on which each and every have formally distinct meanings that hook up with different bits of non-linguistic cognition, in particular object files and ensembles. And then that proposal makes a couple of novel predictions about pragmatic use that can be derived from those kind of differences between those non-linguistic systems. So we'll talk about a couple of those predictions that we tested. Okay, first, just a brief intro to these quantifiers. So one thing that's been noticed about them for a long time is that each is somehow more individualistic than every. There's this paper from Zeno Wendler in the 60s where he asks people to imagine a basket of apples, and he says, you know, it's fine to say take every one of them, but if you say take each one of them, it kind of sounds incomplete. You want to finish it with something like take each one of them and examine it, or something like that. Here's a similar data point. It's fine to say in this talk I combine every theory of quantification, whereas comparatively it's a little bit stranger to say I combine each theory of quantification. And then here's another example of each being more individualistic. It can give rise to these pair list responses, even where every can't. So this kind of question, which book did you loan to each student? One way to understand that is it suggests a different book for each student. And so you can answer, well, I loaned Frankenstein to Frank, Persuasion to Paula, Dune to Danny. But the question with every, which book did you loan to every student? It sort of suggests that there's only one book, that all the students got the same book. And so these sorts of examples, I mean, they're delicate, subtle, but they show that every is a bit more friendly to groups than each is. And we see the same kind of work, or the same sort of result in psycholinguistic work. So in particular, in some prior work, we find that if you ask people to evaluate sentences like each or every circle is green, then they remember different things about the scene you show them. So with each, people are better at recalling individual properties of a scene. So in this example, this was a case where we showed participants pictures of 3 circles. They say whether it's true or false that each or every circle is green. The circles disappear, and then they flash back on the screen. And now you have a change detection task. So you say, did one of the circles change color? That's an individual property, one of the circles color. And as predicted, people who got that each question were better at that change detection task than people who got the every question. But those results flip if you instead probe a group property. So if you ask them how many circles were there, instead of asking what was one particular circle's color. Again, the only thing different between these conditions in these experiments is just whether you use each or every. And so that suggests that expressions like each circle lead people to encode and recall information about the individuals, whereas expressions like every circle lead people to group the circles and recall information about them kind of as a collection. So all that to say, there's a lot of data, linguistic and psycholinguistic, suggesting, well, each is somehow more individualistic than every. And that leads us to this proposal about what those meanings might look like. So why might that be, and how they're related to non-linguistic cognition. So the idea is that in a sentence like each frog is green, it's got a totally individualistic meaning that calls for individuating the domain of quantification, so the frogs in this case. Whereas every frog is green is really similar, but its meaning is formally different in a way that calls for grouping the frogs up. The formal difference we're employing here is this well-known distinction in logic between quantifying into first order or lowercase variable positions on the top with each case versus allowing quantification into second order positions, the uppercase variables in the every case. But what's important is that the argument is that these formally distinct meanings interface with different non-linguistic cognitive systems. So the individualistic each meaning serves as an instruction to cognition to say, hey, treat the domain as object files. And object files are essentially pointers to individual things, which with individual properties bound. So properties like the kind of thing it is, the hue, the size, and so on. Whereas the group part of every's meaning invites you to create an ensemble representation instead, which is this way of representing groups. Ensembles abstract away from individual things and they represent the whole collection in terms of kind of summary properties like average hue, average size, center of mass of the collection, cardinality, things like that. And there's been a lot of work in cognitive and developmental psychology on these two representational systems. Just two important things to note for this project here. One is that object files encode individual properties, whereas ensembles abstract away in favor of those kind of summary properties I mentioned a second ago, like average size. And the second is that object files are subject to a strict working memory limit. So there's a lot of work suggesting in kids and adults, the limit's basically 3, whereas ensembles don't have that limit. You can kind of represent as many things as you want under an ensemble. That's, I mean, there's a sense in which that's the point of having this second system of representation. So you get around that kind of working memory limitation by just abstracting away from the individual things. And so just to recap briefly, the idea is that there's formal differences between the meanings of these expressions, each and every, that leads them to interface with different non-linguistic systems, object files and ensembles. And now we can use those properties that we know that those two representational systems have to try to derive some predictions about, well, how are each and every going to get used differently? And I'll talk about two of them. So namely, if each and every connect to object files and ensembles in that way I described, the properties of those systems should lead to downstream pragmatic consequences for how they get used. The first one is because ensembles aren't subject to that working memory constraint, every should be preferred for bigger domains. So just when you're quantifying over more things. The thought is if you're representing a lot of things, you're going to probably want to do it with an ensemble. Every serves as an instruction to represent the things you're quantifying over as an ensemble. And so that's just going to be a better fit for a bigger domain. I'll just flag, this isn't to say you couldn't use every with a small domain, you couldn't use each with a big domain. Of course you could. The idea is just that this aspect of the related non-linguistic cognitive system has a consequence of kind of adding some pressure to use every in this situation where you've got a lot of things. And then the second prediction, which I'll come back to in a second, is that because ensembles represent the relevant things in terms of generalizations, every should be preferred for generalizing beyond a locally established domain. So for extending claims beyond the local domain in question. But first, we'll just think about the size prediction. So we tested this in a couple of ways. One was a 2 alternative forced choice task where we showed people slightly different context sentences. So in this item, this is one of the items, it's the bartender at the local tavern has made 3 martinis versus the bartender at the local tavern has made 3,000 martinis. And people's task is to choose which sentence is a better continuation. He said that each martini he made had an olive, or he said that every martini he made had an olive. And as predicted, the bigger domain increases the rate of responding every. So in a context with 3,000 martinis, for example, people are more likely to pick the every sentence over the each sentence compared to in a context with only 3 martinis. You can see from looking at this plot, it's not like small domains got people picking each more than 50% of the time. So in general, there's kind of another, there's an every bias with the sentences we used here for whatever reason. But the important point is that changing the domain size matters in this predicted way. Bigger domains made people more likely to pick every over each. And you can see this in a more naturalistic setting too. So when we look at corpora of parent-child interactions, this is from a LSA proceedings paper Victor Gomez and I just wrote. So it's looking at speech to kids. We find more than half the time that parents use each, there are 3 or fewer things that are being quantified over. Whereas when they use every, they're more often than not using every to quantify over domains of more than 3 things. So that's within that that's that working memory limit cutoff. So you see this preference for each with smaller domains, 3 or fewer, and every with larger domains, both in the 2AFC task and in this corpus data. But here's an even more direct way to get at this prediction. So you can just ask people, if someone said each martini needs an olive, how many do you guess they have in mind? And for each, our participants were more likely to guess a small number. So 2/3 of them actually guessed a number below 4, again, in that working memory limit. Whereas given the same sentence, but with every, people are more likely to guess bigger numbers. And only 1/3 of participants guessed 3 or fewer. In fact, what a lot of them said for every was something that wasn't countable. So they say things like all martinis generally, every martini ever made, an unlimited amount, responses like that. And this kind of segues into the second prediction, because a lot of those responses suggest that it's not just about every being preferred for bigger domains than each, but also that every is better for kind of generalizing. So just intuitively to get a sense of this, each martini needs an olive. I think you can naturally understand that to mean there are some particular cocktails that need garnishes. So like maybe you mix the 3 drinks and you want to ask your friend to help get them ready to serve, and you say each one needs an olive before you serve it. Every martini needs an olive can be understood in the same way, but I think it also has an understanding as a more general claim. So the kind of thing you might see in a drink recipe. That makes sense given this contrast we've been discussing, because not only do ensemble representations support arbitrarily large domains, get around that working memory limit, they're also represented in terms of generalizations. So summary statistics, in the visual domain, things like average size and average hue are essentially generalizations over the whole collection. So just to give a more kind of systematic test of this idea, we first ran another version of the 2 alternative forced choice task. So here the context mentioned a small domain, bartender made a few martinis, and participants have to choose between each or every. The difference is, does the sentence have a relative clause that references that domain? Each martini that he made has an olive, or does it have a relative clause that explicitly tries to go beyond that domain? So every martini that's worth drinking. For the cases that have the relative clause that explicitly goes beyond the domain, so the one in blue, people were more likely to choose every than for the cases where the relative clause referenced the domain from the context sentence. One thing you might wonder about this is, well, okay, but isn't that just the domain size effect all over again? Because probably it's true the martinis worth drinking that you're imagining outnumber the ones that the bartender made. And so you're not really going beyond a domain. You're not extending a domain at all. It's just that you're, with the relative clause, you're setting 2 different domains and one's bigger than the other. And so to try to get around this potential confound about it just being another case of domain size, we tested this prediction in another way as well. In this task, we introduced people to these novel creatures. We said, look at these daxes, look at these 3 daxes. Then we said each or every dax is green. And then we introduce a new one and say there's another dax under the tree. It's hidden by the shadow. How confident are you that that dax is green? Okay, and we gave people a 7-point scale, totally unsure, completely certain. And we find that people who were initially introduced to the creatures with every are more confident about the unseen one being green. So that supports this idea that every is better for generalizing. That is, if you initially introduce the creatures with every dax as green, it makes it easier to extend the domain from those initial 3 to this new domain that also includes the 4th one. We replicated this a couple ways. Here's one with a new batch of participants. This time we made the daxes homogeneous, so we made them identical shades of green, thinking, well, homogeneity is one way to make it more likely that people will group the daxes, group the objects, and generalize over them. And you do see a slightly higher rate of generalization across the board, but you still see this effect of each versus every, where every makes them even more comfortable generalizing. And then in the same vein, we tried this third version with 5 daxes instead of 3. So again, having more things makes it more likely people would generalize. Again, overall confidence gets higher, but you still see a slight effect of each versus every even here. So the linguistic framing, if you want to call it that, kind of seems robust even as we ramp up other cues to generalize over the creatures and treat them as a group. Okay, to sum up those results, so every is preferred for larger domains and also for when intending to generalize beyond some local domain. And we think this is, one case. It's a case study where a formal semantic difference causes 2 very similar expressions to interface with different non-linguistic cognitive systems And then the properties of those different systems can lead to downstream predictions about pragmatic preferences. So more generally then, I think just thinking about the formal aspects of meaning and the details of the connected cognition can help explain what might be otherwise puzzling patterns about pragmatic preferences. Okay, thanks.